Well, good morning, Center of Hope. It is Wednesday, April 4th at about 11:15 in the morning. And today I want to encourage you during this time of the COVID-19 crisis, a crisis which I think is affecting people more than just from a physical health standpoint, but very much a mental health standpoint. I am hearing more and more that people are struggling with their mental health in a greater way. And I think that includes people who both have generally good mental health most days and people who struggle with mental health on a regular basis. There are some principles I think that we can pull from a story about Jesus in his time in the Garden of Gethsemane that I think will be incredibly helpful for each one of us. Let me read the story and then I'll give you the principles and then I will work through what they are. So, Matthew 26, starting at verse 36 through to the end of 39, says this. Then Jesus went with them being the disciples, to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me." And going a little further, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." There are four things I think we can pull from this story that are coping mechanisms or coping strategies that Jesus uses to deal with what was possibly, I think, the most critical mental health episode that Jesus would ever go through. Here's what they are. Number one, Jesus has familiar places, familiar structure, and discipline that he engages in. Number two, Jesus is vulnerable to his friends and or family. Number three, Jesus is vulnerable to God. And number four, Jesus submits to God in the midst of the mental health crisis. So let's take a look at the story and see if I can pull some of these out, help you out with it a little bit. So this story takes place basically immediately after Jesus finished his Last Supper with his disciples. And so he leaves the upper room and he goes to this place called Gethsemane, which was a garden. Gethsemane means olive press. Now, that's an interesting thing, maybe a little bit ironic. An olive press was used to press out oil. And here we have Jesus going into a time of intense pressing in his life, where his physical, his mental, his emotional, and spiritual health were all going to be pressed. We're all going to be tested. And so he goes to this place called Gethsemane, and he goes there with his disciples. And he says, "Sit while I go over there and pray." So the first thing I mentioned was that Jesus engages in familiar places and familiar structure or disciplines. Jesus could have gone anywhere to go and pray. He chooses to go to Gethsemane. This suggests to me that this was a place that Jesus was familiar with, perhaps a place he'd been to before. And not only does he go to a place that he's familiar with, but he also goes to a place that he's familiar with to engage in what was a regular practice for him. The scriptures tell us again and again in the Gospels that oftentimes Jesus would go off alone to pray, or that he would go to pray. This was a regular discipline for him. When mental health crisis comes along, I think we're like a person who's sitting in a canoe just hitting the rough water, the white water. And when the panic comes, the first thing we do is we drop the paddle and grab the gunnels. So instead of doing the things that we should normally do when we're going into white water, which is to hold on to that paddle and use it to direct us where we need to go, in crisis, we often just drop the paddle, grab the gunnels, and hope we're going to get through. See, holding on to the paddle is doing the regular stuff that we would do. And in a case where we're struggling with mental health, where things are going a little bit sideways, we need to ensure that we don't lose sight of our regular places and our regular disciplines. So if prayer is a regular discipline for you, don't stop doing that. If you go on a walk every day, just because you're feeling mentally unwell, try to do the walk. Try to do the things that are normal. Remember, we're having, because I have these situations too, you're having a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. What's the best way to deal with that? Best way to deal with that is to continue to do the normal things and be in the normal places. Now, I know because of the social distancing thing, normal places is maybe a little bit restrictive. Do your best. Do what you can. Stay with the normal places, the familiar structures and disciplines. The second thing we're told is that Jesus takes his disciples with him. Now, he only took 11 because, not the full 12, because Judas had already bailed out and was betraying him at that moment. But he takes the 12, the rest of the 12 with him. And then as he gets there, he takes Peter, James, and John. Those are the two sons of Zebedee, James and John. That was his inner circle in the midst of the group of 12. And he takes them a little further with him. And what does he do? He says, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me." Well, what I see Jesus doing here is him being vulnerable to his friends, to his closest friends, the people he can trust. He lets his heart out. He lets everything that's going on deep inside of him out to them. And he says, just sit and watch with me. By the way, if you're a person who's sitting with someone who's walking through a mental health crisis, don't tell them it's going to be okay. Just listen. Sit and watch with them the way Jesus asked his disciples to sit and watch with him. Be with them in the moment, in the struggle. Be that person that will give them a sense of normalcy in the midst of it. So Jesus is vulnerable to his friends, opens up, gives his entire heart to them about how bad it is. I am so sad. I am so full of sorrow. It's like death is taking over. I am so hurting right now that I could die. Don't be afraid to open up and be real with the people that you trust. The third thing that Jesus does is he continues with vulnerability, but he becomes vulnerable with God. So it says he goes a little farther and he falls on his face and he prays and he says, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me." So first of all, the cup, that was the fact that he was about to suffer. He was about to be crucified. He was about to be beaten and mocked. Literally, he was beaten so badly that the flesh was literally hanging off his back. It's more than a person really could stand, and yet he lived through it. And he knows this is what's coming. And he says, "Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me." He shared with God his heart's intention or his heart's desire, which is, I don't want to go through this. If it's possible, please don't let me go through this. I want to suggest it's important that we're vulnerable to God. And it's not just about saying, well, God knows what's in my head. That's enough. No, I want to encourage you, take the extra step of vulnerability and intimacy with God where you speak out with your mouth what's really on the inside. There's going to be anger. There's going to be fear. There's going to be anxiety. There's going to be emotions that are almost impossible to talk about. I want to challenge you to let God have all of that. I've had those moments in my life where I'm frustrated and angry and I rage against the heavens. God, why is this happening? And I'm frustrated. And I let it all out and I'm vulnerable with him. Those are moments when I experience real intimacy with God. And those are the moments when I experience his comfort and his compassion and his grace the most. So be vulnerable with him. The last thing that Jesus does is he submits to God. So the last thing he says is, "Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." You know, God doesn't always remove the situation that we're in, but God is always with us in the situation that we're in. And he knows the course, he knows the path to get out of it. I want to challenge you today, and it's a challenge for me as well, in the midst of a time when our mental health is sliding, submit to God. Say, "God, I'm going to allow you to be the boss through this. I'm going to allow you to lead me through it." Knowing that you have the plan and the solution, knowing that you have not been sideswiped or blindsided by this. So 4 things, let me remember you. Let me help you remember. Familiar places, familiar structures, and disciplines. Continue to do that stuff. Your closest friends and family, be vulnerable to them. Allow them to sit with you and share your heart with them. Tell them about your normal response to the abnormal situation. Thirdly, be vulnerable to God. Let God have everything that you're feeling. Let him know. And don't do it just in your head. Just don't think it. Speak it out. It's very therapeutic, and it allows us to have intimacy with God. And the last thing is submit to God in it. Allow him to lead you through this and guide you through it, even when he's not taking everything away, or even when he's not allowing everything to be taken away. Let me just pray for you. Father, I ask that you would help us in the midst of mental health crises to practice the things that Jesus practiced. That, God, we would continue to do the normal things, knowing that it gives us a sense of normalcy in our lives. Lord, help us to be vulnerable to our friends and vulnerable to you, that they might help us and walk with us through it. And Lord, we ask also that you would help us to submit to you in your leadership, and that you would bless us and take us through the crisis, and that you would bring us out safe and sound on the other side. Lord, I ask that you would help each one of us to have an Easter where we experience both the death and the resurrection of Jesus, and we would have a greater intimacy and love for you as a result. Bless us in Jesus' name. Amen. Have a happy Easter. Thanks.